For someone who's just a deep lover of history and medieval history specifically, many historians who are lovers of medieval history will attest that the medieval era was just a phenomenal time to study. And I want to see if I can do justice to just how far removed we are from these predecessors of ours, for those of us specifically that are Catholic. And I got to thinking about it, and ultimately I think this is going to turn into a multiple series of videos. There's just no way that you can do justice to the Middle Ages in one or two or even like 15 videos. And as I get the time and as different things come to me, I'll be putting together multiple parts, and I'll kind of blanket them all under this title of the Middle Ages. Next, we're going to be looking at how to reclaim the Dark Ages as a period that's highly misunderstood. It's a title. The Dark Ages is a title that's imposed on this period sort of haphazardly, and it's unfortunate that it's stuck, but it allows many people who are otherwise lazy about history to sort of overlook a very essential time in our history. Now, I could have easily begun with that live, specifically reclaiming the Dark Ages, and maybe I should have, but I think it's important, and I think there's something to be said about just beginning with the people themselves, who they were, what kind of things did they take seriously? What were they concerned about? What were they not concerned about? And what was their life like? What was their faith like? And as you can tell, not being in my normal place of residence, I think I've got some sort of minor sketches of notes here, and again, it's not going to be as detailed. We're going to save some of the more detailed lives for a later time. So, with the generalized analysis now, I want to begin with first off, just a few disclaimers. One is that it's not my intention to laud or idealize the period, as there are certainly some things about the Middle Ages that none of us would want to contend with. I mean, just for example, a big one that I think about a lot when I'm like, would I want to live in the Middle Ages? Well, I really appreciate modern day sanitation. And, something like the germ theory of disease, for example, has given a lot of us longevity and made that, a long life feasible, whereas many of us would be in our old age or probably buried at this point underground in a grave by now, were it not for some of the modern discoveries that you just wouldn't have had in the Middle Ages. Not to mention the things, like we take for granted, just indoor conveniences like AC or plumbing or electricity or air filtration, right? All of these things that we take for granted today. I appreciate and I enjoy those things. And yet there is something romantic about this time as well. I mean, we live on the other end of the Protestant Revolution, a revolution whose propaganda against that era has sort of been the standard bearer for centuries now, until more recently, like modern academia has begun to really finally revisit the Middle Ages. And even here in the United States, there's this Puritan strain that runs through our history that has tainted our philosophy, our lives. And I have often seen, and I'm sure many of you probably have too, ill-informed traditionalists espousing ideas or solutions that would easily have landed them within the Puritan camp in another era. So and we as Catholics, we also live on the other end of the Council of Trent, right? See my previous video on that, on the Reform era of the Catholic Church. So we have Trent. We're post Protestant Revolution. We're post the Tridentine Revolution. We're post all of these national revolutions like the French Revolution in the 19th century revolutions of Europe. The scientific revolution we're past now, the industrial revolution, right? All of these revolutions that have sort of shaped modernity have really made what was the Middle Ages sort of an alien period to us. And those of us here in the United States, we're progeny of people that fled the old country, right? Many of us are, and in many ways, we have lost a lot of our identity, even more so than maybe some of you who still live in the old world. So I want to, in this series, find a balance between the subjectively or even sometimes objectively the good and the bad. I mean, both at the level of the peasantry, but also with the clergy, and maybe even we'll touch upon in some other videos like the monarchy and like the nobility. There were factors in all of these strata of society at the time that needed reform, undoubtedly. There are parts that we should have actually retained, though, that we didn't end up retaining from the Middle Ages. To the point, that many of you, some of these things that we've lost, many of you, even watching this video, would probably be scandalized by what the medieval people were like, necessarily or unnecessarily, depending on what subject we're going to be broaching. Oh, and with that thought about some of the subjects we're going to be broaching, I would like to warn that this is probably not one for the children. Um, so I don't know, whoever's watching this, just as a little disclaimer here at the beginning, I like you am a product of the 21st century post-Puritan revolution. And I cringe at what some of our forebears, even though I love the Middle Ages, I cringe at what some of them thought was acceptable. So in keeping with the times, right? While I will avoid explicit talk in any of these videos that I do, I would probably, if I had to gauge it, I would say this is probably a subject that's like teenager age or above. Okay, so with that long introduction out the way, who were we talking about here? Well, like all of history, placing a concrete timetable and locale to the Middle Ages is a bit tricky and even controversial. Generally speaking, though, it begins around the year 476 AD with the fall of Western Rome. Yet I want to stress this isn't so clear cut as a nice, pristine year would make it out to be, even though that sort of helps us with textbooks. For one, Rome, the idea of Rome as an imperial empire really did continue on for many more centuries after 476. It just did so in the eastern part of the Christian world, in the area that we today refer to as Byzantium. Though the people themselves of the East would not have referred to themselves as Byzantines, they would have referred to themselves as Roman. Second thing to keep in mind about the fall of the empire and this time that we call the Middle Ages is that the people in the West would not, you wouldn't have been standing in the year 477 after the sack of Rome and have said, well, here we are now. We are in the Middle Ages finally, right? Goodbye, ancient world. These things are gradual, right? They happen in phases, sometimes more extreme in some places than others, depending on where you were. And in my opinion, it's more helpful to view as you sort of come out of the ancient world and into the medieval world, it's more helpful to view it as a slow transition and as a reformation, right? Rather than a fall and a collapse, which kind of to me implies and puts in people's minds something that's like instant and complete. I mean, remnants of civil Rome, just for example, survived all through the Middle Ages and really, really survived right up to our own day, right? As far as many of the way that we view law and like precedents and legal decisions, right? So much of this stuff has its antecedent in ancient Rome. So now technically this early period, right, coming out of the ancient world after the fall of Rome, the early period is known to us as the Dark Ages. Though again, that's controversial. The Dark Ages was initially intended to be a specific time of early European medieval history. The reason it was called the Dark Ages was for historical, evaluative purposes, due to the fact that in the West, after the Barbarian Wars, there's a real lack of available resources for us to study. So the Dark Ages are dark for us, not for the people themselves. All right. So that's the misconception. And the Dark Ages, that title has been imposed upon the entire area of this middle period. Though it's so anachronistic, it's laughable at this point by most historians. So we'll discuss that more next time in the next live when we talk about reclaiming the Dark Ages. But this early period is roughly from the fall of Rome up until the 10th century, early medieval history we're talking about. And some key features of early medieval history is one, the barbarian migrations over the continent of Europe. So you think about the impetus we believe for the barbarians migrating at this point was because there's this push from the east, principally with the Huns and their raids into Europe sort of pushes these what Romans called barbarians. They're just different tribes of people pushing into the West. So the tribes are moving around at this point in time. You also, as I mentioned, you have the rise of the Eastern Byzantine Empire in this early period. You have the rise of Islam coming up out of the Arabian desert, right? And that whole history of Islam. And probably the most important for us in the Western Catholic Latin camp is the formation of the Carolingian Empire and that long gradual process that begins of a Western hegemony, really centuries later, but it really begins and has its precedence in the Carolingian Empire, formed with the reign of Charlemagne. So trying to parcel out and speak about the people of this early period is difficult because the later period, the High Middle Ages, right? The High Middle Ages was hard fought for its own existence, right? And it was forged in this earlier time, yet it's forged by a diverse array of people, many of whom were unrelated to the other people, right? You tend to think of again, in this post-national revolution age that we live in, we tend to think of German people or French people or Spanish people, right? But at the time, it's really just a hodgepodge that's starting to coalesce, starting to form, but it's hard to make like general statements about the period, about the people of this period. It's not until much later that we see something that we could effectively call a unified Christendom of the West. Which leads me to the next period, which is what is known as the High Middle Ages. And this is the area that I am more interested in and have studied at more depth. The High Middle Ages is sort of my principal area of interest. and it's marked by some key consolidations, right? So first off, while you don't have anything like national borders that you would come to recognize today, so what we were just talking about, we do have the emergence of the Holy Roman Empire, which is sort of the bulk of the Holy Roman Empire, though there's little pockets of it, like in modern day Spain or like modern day Belgium or Holland. The bulk of it makes up what we would call modern day Germany and northern Italy. You also have in the High Middle Ages the formation and the emergence of the Kingdom of France. And related to that, eventually you will see the Kingdom of England sort of carve out a place for itself. Now, keep in mind at this time, you also have the Al Andalus in Spain and its counterpoint, the Christian Reconquista, taking place. That's all going to be in the far west of Europe, in the Spanish, in the region of modern day Spain. Another key consolidation of this point, probably the most important to affect medieval Western Christendom, is you have the rise of the medieval papacy, especially after Pope St. Gregory VII and his reforms, and especially his reforms over the relation between the temporal and the spiritual powers. I would recommend, I did a whole series on that on the medieval, it's called The Fall and Rise of the Medieval Papacy. If you're interested in that, go back and watch those videos. As well as it's the papacy at this point, it sort of gives a certain credibility to the newly and extremely influential mendicant orders that are forming in this high Middle Ages, particularly what we would recognize today as the Dominicans and the Franciscans, as well as the papacy is playing its role in the suppression and elimination of certain heresies like the Albigensian heresy, right? So the papacy sort of comes into its own in the High Middle Ages as a sort of consolidated power. Added to this, you have the formation of universities in the West, with Latin as its universal tongue, which really helped to bind the European. If you really want to look at Europe, it's kind of a peninsula of the greater Asian continent. What bound it together really originally was this Latin tongue, and it helped make Europe into the combination of the papacy and Latin helps sort of define medieval Europe as this unified hegemonic place with a common religion, common civil laws, and common customs. And it was such that a learned man of this time could travel all over medieval Europe and with ease find a place for himself in any place that he happens to land where he could converse and share ideas with other learned. Another important factor was that during this time, Europe entered a period of warming in the climates, where the average temperatures rose enough, and there were innovations in farming that allowed for larger populations to emerge, especially in the cities were sort of forming in kind of surprising places in the Middle Ages. I mean, Paris, for example. Paris was nowhere. If you look in the ancient world, the city of Paris wasn't really on the radar of anybody. And Paris emerges, I mean, the Parisian world emerges out of this medieval world. And it's the University of Paris plays a huge part in this, right? But the ability for these cities to grow and propagate in the way that they did was largely due to the warming of the climate and the ability of the Europeans to sustain larger populations. Okay, so this is all on a macro level, but you're here because you want to know about the people, right? That's what this talk is supposed to be about. Well, this is a bit challenging, and here's the problem, right? If you imagine the high Middle Ages populations as a pyramid, and at the very tiny top of the pyramid, you have the smallest group, which is the monarchs. Right under that, you have the group of the nobility. And under that, you have the class of knights and clergy. And at the wide bottom, you have the peasants who make up 80% of the entire population. Now, at the time of the Middle Ages, you don't have a class of people that we would refer to today as historians per se, with history being this sort of like marked project, this scientific endeavor. Instead, you have a very small class of men, either monastics or occasionally among the ranks from the learned nobles, who we today call the chroniclers. And as you could imagine, with the written page being such an expensive commodity, as well as the time it took to train someone to read and write, the chroniclers were not accustomed to documenting the life of the peasants. Most of what we have of recorded history covers that top tier, right? The monarchs, the nobility. Occasionally you will have the events of like when a war breaks out, a significant war, so the knightly class and the wars, and even the events of religion and the clergy class. That massive bulk, that huge majority that existed at the bottom, we have frustratingly little sources to work with. We have, for example, you might have like a consensus. You have the church's sacramental documents, like on baptisms. You have criminal cases, both civil and religious. Excuse me. Occasionally, you'll have like folk rituals and festivals that survive the Middle Ages that sort of give us a hint at what life was like. And then you have, very scant archaeological evidence left of what life would have been like. But we don't have much, right? And yet, despite this challenge, historians have done a remarkably good job, in my opinion, of sort of piecing together, however fragmentary, a decent picture of what medieval life for the peasant was like. And it's quite surprising to those of us who were raised on a Protestant diet of what medieval history was like. The very first thing that we want to get away from, and what I would like you to get away from as sort of a takeaway from this video, is I want you to get away from seeing these people as dumb, as darkened intellects, or as superstitious or like dirty, right? Like physically dirty. The fact is, medieval peasants were quite a lively bunch of people, okay? Now, while they're not, no, they're not educated in that like scholastic sense of learning of the time, right? We think of the great monastics like the Dominicans and the Franciscan intellectuals. They're not like scholastic learning, right? Like I wouldn't have existed with this channel here on YouTube in the Middle Ages. I would have been out back like farming some land. We'll get to that in a second. But while they're not learned in that sense, we know that they were quite industrious. We have quite a few inventions that come from this medieval period, including a really brilliant yoke. So the yoke is what goes around the cattle's neck and allows them to pull a plow. This stuff is interesting, right? So don't leave me here because we're talking about farming, right? This yoke that they had would have, in the earlier times, would have choked and killed the horses. Well, the medievals invented a yoke that horses could wear that would allow the horses to pull the plow to plow the land, right? And it made the process significantly faster, which again sort of allowed them to cultivate larger areas of land, which means more food, which means more people and animals could be fed. As well, they invented some really ingenious methods of irrigation, and they also came up, probably most consequentially, came up with a three-tiered rotation of crops that both took and replenished the essential element of nitrogen in the soil. Right, it sort of takes it from the soil at one point and puts it back into the soil at the next point. So this three-tiered rotation helped keep the land arable. Now, they were also, while they're given, and we'll probably cover the superstitious elements at another point, while they were given to points of superstition, They were no more marked by it than people of other ages, including our own age. In fact, some of them had, I would say, healthier views. I mean, even with somebody like Thomas Aquinas remarking how, when properly understood and exercised, there was a place for even things like astrology within society. Nor, by the way, were they dirty. And that image of the dirty peasant is completely a post-industrial revolution myth. You really don't see Europeans quit bathing until quite late, really around the time of the Tudor Reformation. Medieval people loved to bathe. For one thing, they thought of themselves as the heirs of the Romans, right? And they were going to have their public baths just like the Romans did. They even had very effective soaps made of animal fat and wood ash. And depending on where you lived, you may have just had like a small basin that you did your daily cleaning of like essential areas. But you would also have, like, once a week, you would have this communal public bath that you could go to, or they would just use rivers and streams for like a proper washing, like once a week. The communal baths were also places of socializing, which brings up two factors about medieval life that's worth covering here. One is their views on community, and the other is their views on sex. Now, as far as community goes, life in the Middle Ages is there's no real concept of individualism, let alone the sort of rugged individualism that we, in the United States with our American ethos have, right? Communal life to the people of the Middle Ages is absolutely everything. Familiarity bred trust. Okay. The stranger was the person that was seen with suspicion, right? In fact, one of the reasons that monastics were tonsured was so that communities knew to welcome him in, right? He had a visible sign of why this person would be traveling, right? So, like the mendicants, the Franciscans, they're wearing beggars' clothing. So people would be like, who's this beggar at the gates, right? And looking at it, they're, oh, right, so he's tonsured, right? So we know to let him in. Everything in medieval social structure revolved around and relied upon high degrees of certainty, right? Peasants were relied upon to till the land, to farm, and to provide enough crop to feed this growing populations of people and their animals. And where you were born, whatever status it may be, is where you died. Your family, for example, may work a few like strips of land that are part of this greater field, and each strip being worked is being worked by different families, right? So you may have like 3 strips of land in this greater field, and another family has another 3, and another family another 3, right? And your family, right, your strips of land, it wouldn't be owned by you, right? It would be owned by the person, by the lord who owns the land. It's where we get landlord from, right? And your family might have that same 3 strips for generations, right? Your great 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 grandfather might have plowed these same 3 strips of land that you could look forward to plowing for the rest of your life, that your kids and your grandkids could look forward to plowing for the rest of their life. And there was a real stability to that way of life, as cringe as it is for those of us in modernity, right? Um, while I necessarily, while I, as the peasant, didn't own the land, I worked, right? I also had no fear of being evicted from it. The landlord had a certain prerogative and responsibility to make sure that those 3 strips of land went to my kids, that I retained it, and my kids went to them as well, right? So there's a high level of certainty. Now, going back to the other thing about the communal baths was that they were mostly intersex. Both men and women bathed together, and this is really when you start getting into that, like, gosh, we are really removed well, I mean, there's so many ways, right? Like, none of us would want to own probably the same 3 strips of land and that's all we get to look forward to in life, right? Like we're so like social mobility and rising up in it is so ingrained in us today that that is kind of like a scary prospect of like life in the Middle Ages. Same for this, right? Now, ideally, this was based strictly on utilitarian purposes, right? There's a communal bath, we're all just taking advantage of it. But we know that as humans, fallen humans, that this was often the medieval equivalent of sort of a hookup place, okay? We do have church authorities of the time advising people not to bathe so often. And it's not because they believed that there was anything inherently wrong with bathing in itself. Rather, they did not want what they feared to be going on there to be a place for you to be, what do they call it, when you're exposing yourself to the occasion of sin, right? That's what they're warning about when you see the medieval church advising against baths. And another thing is because of this tendency to be using the communal baths as as this sort of intersex place where hooking up happens, they also tend to function as brothels as well. Which gets to another point. It's the medieval views on sexuality, which are much different than our own. So without being crude, right? I really want to avoid that. We'll just point out a few things that would probably surprise you. One of the first things that really, in my opinion, really seems to surprise people is that at the time, the mentality was that the gender that was more inclined towards sex was actually the females. Okay. Men were seen as the more reasoned, more given to cultivating virtue and quieting the passions, whereas women were seen as sort of unable to control their urges. And this is kind of flipped today, has it not? Right? Like we're on the other side of the Victorian Revolution, right? Where in the English speaking world, right, women are sort of lifted up as this sort of model of, innocence and virtue, with the men being more inclined to lust and passions. Well, in the Middle Ages, it's really the polar opposite view of that. For a man in the Middle Ages to gain a reputation for promiscuity actually made him more likely to be ridiculed by his fellow men as being too feminine. If you can believe that, that was sort of the um, when the guys get together and we're like razzing each other for the stupid thing that your buddy did. Well, this would be one of the things you would be razzing them about, right? Now, of course, we know that brothels were present in all cities and in many towns. So, of course, the reality still dictates that men were the ones pursuing sex. And there was a surprising laxity around the existence of brothels, too, by the way, which would surprise many of you. The attitude from both civil authorities and ecclesial authorities towards the existence of these brothels was really, so long as they're confined to certain quarters and so long as you go to confession, right? It's kind of a, necessary evil. Now, of course, that presented a challenge to the women because a confessor would be obliged not to absolve them because he knew they would be going back to that practice. So it was sort of a conundrum there, right? But from Aquinas, from Augustine to Aquinas, the attitude was that prostitution was a necessary evil. So better to have it in the city, or at least on the outskirts of the city, right, than to have men walking around burning with lust. Another essential feature to this communal life was the liturgical calendar. And this deserves its own talk. I mean, but because the life of the peasant was so intrinsically wrapped up with the calendar that it's hard for modern people to process what this was actually like, being born into it and raised around it, that it's all you've ever known and it's all you ever will know, right? The calendar dictates when you can work what days you can eat, what days you can celebrate, what days you must do penance. And peasants really seem to have lived by the calendar quite piously. It was frustrating for them at times, no doubt. I mean, when you think of like when we sort of think about all the holidays that they had, right? And like, wow, that would be so awesome to have all of those holidays today. But at the time, they saw some of them as sort of a nuisance, right? When you're stuck staying at home, observing some holy day of obligation, and your field needs tending to, right? That would be a source of frustration for some of these peasants. But you still get the sense that these people really took their faith seriously in ways that we don't today. While many of us kind of put on certain airs about our holiness, I have to, you have to wonder, how seriously do we really take it, right? The medieval people, for example, were so concerned about when the say at the liturgy, when consecration took place, that you see this custom of the ringing of the bells begin, right? So that you know that where you are in the process of consecration. As well, you begin to see the elevation of the host become a thing, because their medieval piety began this custom of sincere and reverent devotion towards the Eucharist that you didn't necessarily see in the early church. Mixed into this whole idea of the calendar is you have a real love for celebration and festival in the medieval world. And I think that's why even today, like so-called Renaissance festivals are so popular, even though really they're medieval fairs. But it's as if people know that this was a time when festivals and celebrations were really a part of culture, ingrained in who the people are, right? As with all things medieval, the types of festivities that they were engaging in would probably scandalize a lot of you, right? Probably the most fascinating, and in some ways the most notorious, was this festival called the Feast of Fools. And this particular feast, I think, illustrates better than any other just kind of how far removed we are from these times, right? Because depending on where you were when how this was celebrated, it would have looked differently. But the general theme was that all day, all of society was upended, right? The top became the bottom and the bottom became the top. And remember that, keep in mind, right, just how important and how much all of life was based upon and revolved around stability of the social order. Well, this celebration was kind of a medieval equivalent of like a meta narrative, right? Where the people were basically acknowledging this by overturning it for a day. Really, really fascinating festival. Basically, what would happen is you would have this feast day, right? It was sort of based upon the idea of feast days in the liturgical calendar that was styled after a liturgical feast, where you would have, say, just for example, a town, like a young boy in the town, or even like the town drunk or something like that, who would dress up as bishop. And so basically the lowest of what was considered class in society were sort of put on the top, and the top was put on the bottom, right? You wouldn't necessarily see bishops out there engaging in this, but you would see lower clergy participating in this. And there were mock liturgies that took place, right? I mean, inside the parish on the Feast of Fools, it wasn't uncommon to see like barbecuing taking place near the big celebration, right? We're going to barbecue in the parish, taking place right there next to the altar. All through town, people would be in the streets on this day. They'd be wearing masks, engaging in acts that would usually be condemned as provocative to public decency, even for the times, all with children mingled into the mix, right, as witnesses and celebrants in this thing. So this was so unique because during a time when the cohesion of society was so strictly guarded, to have this basically a day of a social revolution was just a phenomenal attestation to the uniqueness of the medieval people. Now, of course, in the background to this, there's always voices of opposition to many of these practices, usually from churchmen, of course, right? And, and today we still kind of have this conversation. In many respects, the Protestant revolt was an extreme overcorrection of many of the excesses of the High Middle Ages, right? Even before the Protestant Revolution, right? You have men like Savonarola, who I know specifically. I saw some young traditionalist Catholics like lauding Savonarola the other day. And I don't necessarily think Savonarola is someone that we want to hold up as a model for virtue, specifically since he was excommunicated by the Pope, even though it was Pope Alexander VI, who was not, he's one of our more notorious popes, right? Still, to have an excommunication by the Pope is a die excommunicated, having been excommunicated by the Pope is a pretty serious offense. Now, at the same time, right? So like these people, and I mean Savonarola, right, with his bonfires of vanities, they were throwing masks into the bonfires of vanities, and the reason that was it was sort of an overcorrection to the way that some of these people celebrated. What you end up with in the long haul was these groups later coming out of England called the Puritans, right? And what were the Puritans but a very revolutionary group, not unlike 20th century revolutionary groups where the youth used a regimented authoritarian asceticism to revolt against their parents. And I talk about that in the previous live on Trent about how in some ways the Catholic Church tried to quell the excesses without removing completely all of the festive celebratory nature of medieval Europe. So in some ways this was successful, though here in the United States in particular there will always remain this puritanical element that within our ranks, right, that want to turn us into an equivalent of a Cromwellian church with priest investments, right? Now, as is always the sort of tune of this channel, I want to urge caution with that, right? Certainly, we don't want to bring back all the elements of the truly traditional Catholic past, right? Like, I don't want to see farm animals defecating next to our altars during Mass, for example, right? Like, there were, the corrections of Trent were needed. At the same time, I recognize that we also need to not be so hung up, to be so rigid, so puritanical in our faith. The medieval people could really help shine some light on what some of that could look like for us if we're struggling to discern about what we should allow and what we should reject, right? Especially American Catholics, right? Like I'm trying to stress how formed we are by Puritanism in this country that it's hard sometimes to see what should be allowable and what should not be allowable in given circumstances, right? I mean, so like just for example, right, is the Mardi Gras or even Halloween celebrations of today, have they been hijacked and are they a little bit out of hand? Yeah, of course. I think so, right? Does that mean that we need to water them down to the point of absurdity or even to, God forbid, like just forbid them altogether? No, absolutely not. And any Catholic that comes along and tells you that we need to ban our traditional celebrations honestly should be called out and corrected. So this is going on for a long time. I'll touch back on some of these points later in a future live. Next time, like I said, we're going to be looking at some more of the myths around the so-called how these got the title Dark Ages and why they're actually not so dark. And how that's how the Dark Ages is really just a blatant attempt from both Protestants and secularists to sort of discredit the glory of high Christendom in that period, right? So stay tuned for that. Let's see. I see we got some comments here from Aramias. The Western Roman Empire didn't so much collapse as decentralize. Yes. The Italians and the Franks and so forth still recognized the Roman emperor, even if he had become an indirect political force. Indirect political force, them. Yeah, and that's one I kind of want to touch upon. We still, for those of you that are kind of keep up with how some of the Catholic and Orthodox dialogue takes place, you will still eventually see, you will still see Catholics, you will see Orthodox telling us that the Carolingian, that Charlemagne and the Carolingian Empire was a usurpation, right? And I have some comments towards what actually took place then, because it's not so simple as a usurpation of power, because the preceding popes before Pope, oh gosh, was it Leo the third? Which Leo was? I'd have to look it up. One of the Leos crowned Charlemagne, right? That's this moment of usurpation, apparently. Well, many of the preceding popes before that were seeking aid from the empire, right? So the question becomes, right, in this Catholic and Orthodox dialogue about the evil Franks, right? Does a does any power, right? Does any power have the right to borders that they cannot protect? That's kind of the question, right? Backing away from whether or not Charlemagne was a usurper. The question is, if the Eastern Empire was unable to protect the borders of its empire, does it have some inherent right to those borders? That's kind of the key question there. I'm guessing legal prostitution makes affairs between two married people less likely. Maybe that was the reasoning. There, you get quite a few when it comes to, and I'm not an expert in it. There are a few. I kind of avoid it just because it's, I don't know. It's the whole. I mean, medieval sexuality is really fascinating, and the existence and the acceptance towards some of the things that they allowed, including things like brothels. It was a lot of, it was placating, it was special pleading, it was really like getting around some of, now of course, I'm not a civic authority with the responsibility of all, or even an ecclesial authority with all of these people that I'm responsible for. So it's easy for me to sit here on my Monday, what is it called? A Monday quarterbacking, right? Centuries ago, how these people handled the things of their time, right? But I do see there's a lot of special pleading for what took place. All right, so I'll talk to you guys soon. God bless you all.